The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty trading post, and Felicity Owens stumbled out with tears streaming down her face, her dress torn at the shoulder, and her belongings scattered across the floor of the coach behind her. Mason Turner had been loading supplies onto his wagon when he heard the commotion. He turned to see the young woman collapse onto her knees in the dirt, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat into the dust and muttered something about hysterical women before climbing back up to his seat. Mason dropped the flour sack he'd been holding and crossed the distance in 3 long strides. He knelt beside her, keeping his hands visible and his voice low. "Madam, are you hurt?" She flinched away from him, pressing one hand against her torn shoulder as if trying to hold herself together. Her eyes were wild with fear, darting between him and the stagecoach that was already pulling away in a cloud of dust. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I cannot go back, I cannot." Mason glanced around the small settlement of Fort Davis, Texas, noting the curious stares from the handful of people who'd stopped their business to watch. It was October of 1878, and while the town wasn't large, news traveled fast. This woman looked like she'd been through hell itself. "You are safe now," he said firmly, meeting her eyes with absolute certainty. "Whatever happened, whatever you are running from, you are safe here. I mean that." She searched his face for a long moment, and he let her look. He knew what she'd see. A tall man of 26 years with sun-weathered skin, honest brown eyes, and calloused hands that had never been raised in anger against anyone who didn't deserve it. His dark hair was too long, curling at his collar, and his clothes were work-worn but clean. Finally, she nodded once, a tiny movement that seemed to cost her everything she had left. Mason stood and offered his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her smaller hand in his and let him help her to her feet. "My name is Mason Turner. I have a ranch about 5 miles west of here. My sister Sarah lives with me and keeps house. You are welcome to stay there until you figure out what you want to do next." "Felicity," she managed, her voice still thick with tears. "Felicity Owens. I was supposed to marry Gerald Pritchard. He met me at the last stop at the way station 15 miles back." Mason's jaw tightened. He knew Gerald Pritchard, a mean-spirited rancher with a reputation for drinking and worse. What did he do? Felicity's hand flew to the torn shoulder of her dress again, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "He said I wasn't what he ordered, that I was too plain, too thin, not worth the money he'd paid for my passage. He said he'd make me work off my debt instead in whatever way he saw fit. When I refused, when I tried to get back in the coach, he grabbed me and tore my dress. The driver pulled him off and told him to leave me be, said he wouldn't be party to whatever Pritchard had in mind. So Pritchard left me there, said I could walk to Fort Davis and find my own way since I was so particular about my virtue." The fury that rose in Mason's chest was cold and controlled. He'd seen men like Pritchard before, men who thought their money gave them the right to do as they pleased with anyone they considered beneath them. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you to the ranch. You can clean up, rest, and we'll figure this out together." Felicity looked at him with suspicion fighting against desperate hope in her green eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," Mason said simply, "and because nobody deserves to be treated the way Pritchard treated you." She studied him for another moment, then nodded. Mason retrieved the one small trunk that the driver had tossed down before leaving, hoisted it onto his wagon alongside his supplies, and helped Felicity up onto the bench seat. He could feel her trembling as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. The ride out to the Turner ranch was mostly silent. Mason didn't push her to talk, and Felicity seemed lost in her own thoughts, occasionally wiping at the tears that continued to fall. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful in its own way, all red dirt and scrub brush with mountains rising in the distance. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. As they approached the ranch, Mason felt a familiar sense of pride. It wasn't much, not compared to the big spreads owned by men like Pritchard, but it was his. He'd built the house himself with his father before the old man died 3 years back. The barn was sturdy, the fences well maintained, and the cattle that grazed in the distance were healthy and fat. Sarah came out onto the porch as soon as she heard the wagon. She was 2 years younger than Mason, with the same dark hair and honest eyes. Her expression shifted from curious to concerned the moment she saw Felicity. "Mason, what happened?" "This is Miss Felicity Owens," Mason said, climbing down and moving to help Felicity from the wagon. "She's had a rough day and needs a safe place to stay. I told her we'd help." Sarah's eyes went to the torn dress, and understanding flashed across her face. "Of course. Come inside, Miss Owens. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. You look exhausted." Felicity's legs nearly gave out as she stepped down from the wagon, but Mason caught her easily, one arm supporting her weight. "Easy now. When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning, I think," Felicity whispered. "Before I got on the stage for the final leg of the journey." Sarah made a disapproving sound and ushered them both inside. The house was modest but comfortable, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms off to one side, and a small room Sarah used for her own sleeping space on the other. Everything was neat and clean, with touches that showed a woman's care in the embroidered curtains and the wildflowers on the table. "Sit down before you fall down," Sarah commanded gently, guiding Felicity to one of the wooden chairs. "Mason, heat some water. I'll find something for her to wear while we mend her dress." Mason did as his sister asked, stoking the fire and setting a large pot of water to heat. As he worked, he watched Felicity from the corner of his eye. Now that they were in better light, he could see the extent of her distress. Her hair, which might have been neatly pinned that morning, hung in disheveled waves around her face. Her dress, which had probably been her finest, was not only torn but stained with dust and what looked like dried mud. But it was her eyes that caught him most, those green eyes that held such a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and stubborn determination not to break completely. She wasn't the beauty that men wrote poems about, perhaps, but there was something compelling about her face. Her features were delicate, her mouth wide and expressive, and when she wasn't crying, he suspected she had a strong, intelligent look about her. She was thin, as Pritchard had cruelly noted, but not unhealthily so. Just slight, built like someone who'd worked hard all her life and never had quite enough to eat. Sarah returned with a simple brown dress that would fit Felicity well enough. "Come on, dear. Let's get you cleaned up. The bedroom is this way and you'll have privacy. I'll bring the hot water when it's ready." Felicity stood on shaking legs. "You are both so kind. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Don't worry about that now," Sarah said firmly. "Just worry about taking care of yourself." After the women disappeared into the bedroom, Mason carried the heated water to them and then retreated to give Felicity privacy. He stood on the porch, looking out at the land he'd worked so hard to build, and thought about Gerald Pritchard. The man had land, money, and influence in Fort Davis, but he was rotten to the core. Mason had heard stories about how Pritchard treated his workers, about the mysterious bruises his first wife had sported before she died in a riding accident that nobody quite believed was an accident. The thought of Pritchard getting his hands on someone as vulnerable as Felicity made Mason's blood run cold. He'd meant what he said to her. She was safe here, and he'd make sure she stayed that way, no matter what it took. When Sarah called him back inside, Felicity was seated at the table again, wearing Sarah's brown dress and looking slightly more composed. Her hair was still damp from washing, hanging in waves around her shoulders, and her face was clean. The improvement was remarkable. Without the dust and tears, he could see that she had lovely skin, fair and smooth, and her eyes, though red-rimmed, were actually quite striking. Sarah had set out a simple meal of bread, cheese, cold meat, and preserved vegetables. Felicity ate slowly at first, as if she didn't quite trust that the food was real, then with increasing hunger. Mason and Sarah gave her space, carrying on a quiet conversation about the ranch work that needed doing, allowing Felicity to eat in peace without feeling watched. Finally, after she'd eaten her fill and had a cup of Sarah's strong tea, Felicity seemed ready to talk. "I came from Boston," she began, her voice steadier now. "My parents died last year in a factory fire. They both worked at the same textile mill. I tried to keep our rooms, but without their wages, I couldn't manage the rent. I lost everything except what I could carry." Sarah reached across the table and took Felicity's hand. "I'm so sorry." "I saw an advertisement," Felicity continued, "from Mr. Pritchard. He said he was a successful rancher in Texas, looking for a hard-working, honest wife. He didn't require a dowry or beauty, just someone willing to work and help build a good life together. It seemed like a miracle, an escape from the streets of Boston. I wrote to him and he sent money for my passage. The letters were kind, or at least they seemed kind. He said he understood hardship, that he valued character over appearance. But the man you met wasn't anything like his letters," Mason said. Felicity shook her head. "The moment he saw me at the way station, his face changed. He looked at me like I was less than nothing, like I was trash someone had dumped on his doorstep. He said I wasn't pretty enough, wasn't shapely enough, that he'd expected someone who could at least please his eye if she was going to share his bed. When I tried to defend myself, he laughed. He said I'd work in his house as a servant until I'd paid back every cent he'd spent on me, and maybe if I was very good, he'd let me warm his bed sometimes anyway." The last words came out in a rush, and Felicity's hands were shaking again. Sarah squeezed her hand tighter, and Mason felt his anger toward Pritchard grow hotter. "When I refused, when I said I'd rather die than be his slave, he grabbed me. He tore my dress and said I'd better get used to the idea that I belonged to him now. The stagecoach driver intervened, thank God. Mr. Henderson has known me since I got on his stage in San Antonio. He'd been kind to me the whole journey, looking out for me. When he saw what Mr. Pritchard was doing, he pulled his rifle and told him to step back. Mr. Pritchard was furious, but he let me go. He said I could rot in Fort Davis for all he cared, that I'd come crawling back to him soon enough when I had no money and nowhere to go. You will never have to go back to him, Mason said with absolute certainty. You have my word on that. Felicity looked at him, tears forming again. But what can I do? I have no money, no skills except basic housework and some sewing. I cannot impose on your hospitality forever. Mr. Pritchard is right about one thing, I have no options. Sarah spoke up before Mason could. You have options. You can stay here and help me with the house and the garden. Lord knows I could use another pair of hands, and it would give you time to figure out what you want to do next. Maybe find honest work in town, or save money for passage back east if that's what you want. I'll pay you fair wages, Mason added. Room, board, and money of your own. You'll be an employee, not a charity case, and not anyone's property. Felicity stared at them both as if they were speaking a foreign language. You would do that for me. Why? Because it's right, Sarah said simply. And because we've both known what it's like to be alone and struggling. When our parents died, if we hadn't had each other in this ranch, we'd have been in the same position you are now. We help when we can. Besides, Mason added with a slight smile, Sarah's been after me to hire help for months. The garden alone is getting too big for her to manage with everything else she does. You'd be doing us a favor. It wasn't entirely true. Mason could afford help but hadn't bothered to find anyone. But he could see Felicity needed to feel useful, needed to feel like she was earning her keep rather than accepting charity. It was a matter of pride, and he understood that. Felicity looked between them, and for the first time since Mason had seen her, something like hope flickered in her eyes. I would work very hard. I promise you won't regret this. I know we won't, Sarah said warmly. Now you're exhausted. Let me show you where you'll sleep. You can have the spare room. Mason will bring your trunk in. As Sarah led Felicity away, Mason heard her explaining the layout of the house and the daily routine. He went out to fetch Felicity's trunk from the wagon, noting how light it was. Whatever she owned, it wasn't much. When he carried it into the spare bedroom, Felicity was sitting on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the quilt Sarah had made. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "I've never had such a nice room." "Sarah's an excellent quilter," Mason said, setting the trunk down. "She made most of the bedding in the house. If you need anything, just ask. We're not formal people here. We take meals together, work together, and look out for each other." "Thank you," Felicity said, looking up at him with those green eyes. "Thank you for stopping today, for not just walking past me. Thank you for believing me and helping me. I won't forget it." Mason felt something shift in his chest, a warming that had nothing to do with the fire in the other room. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a better day, I promise." He left her there and returned to the main room where Sarah was banking the fire for the night. His sister looked at him with a knowing expression that made him uncomfortable. "What?" he asked. "She's lovely," Sarah said, "and she's clearly been through hell." "I know that. That's why we're helping her." "You looked at her," Sarah said meaningfully. "Of course I looked at her. I was talking to her." Sarah shook her head with a smile. "You know what I mean, Mason. You looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he finds interesting." "Don't start," Mason warned. "She just escaped from one man trying to take advantage of her. The last thing she needs is another man with expectations." "I'm not suggesting you have expectations," Sarah said. "I'm just observing that you noticed her, and that's not a bad thing as long as you're respectful about it. She needs friends right now, people she can trust. Be that for her and see what happens." Mason didn't answer. He headed to his own room, but Sarah's words stayed with him as he lay in bed that night. He had noticed Felicity, noticed her in a way that went beyond simple compassion for someone in trouble. There was something about her resilience, the way she held herself together even when everything had fallen apart, that drew him. But Sarah was right about one thing. Felicity needed safety and stability right now, not romantic attention. He'd be her friend and protector, nothing more. At least not until she was ready for anything else, if she ever was. The next morning, Mason woke before dawn as always and went about his morning routine. He was surprised to find Felicity already in the kitchen when he came in from checking on the animals. She was working at the stove, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You should be resting." "I want to earn my keep," Felicity said. Her eyes were still shadowed with exhaustion, but there was determination in her voice. "Besides, I couldn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing Mr. Pritchard's face." Mason poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. "That will fade with time. Bad memories always do if you give them room to heal. You sound like you speak from experience." "My father died in a ranching accident 3 years ago, fell from his horse and broke his neck. For months afterward, every time I closed my eyes, I saw him lying there in the dirt. But eventually, the good memories started coming back stronger than the bad ones. I could remember him laughing, teaching me to rope, sitting on the porch with my mother before she passed. The pain doesn't disappear, but it gets easier to carry. Felicity was quiet for a moment, tending to the bacon. I'm sorry for your loss. Both your parents, that must have been very difficult. It was. But Sarah and I had each other, and we had this place. It gave us something to work for, a reason to keep going. Sarah emerged from her room, looking surprised and pleased to see breakfast already underway. Well, aren't you a blessing, Felicity? Mason usually just makes coffee and calls it breakfast. I lived alone for months after my parents died, Felicity said. I learned to make a little go a long way. This is simple fare, but it's hot and filling. They ate together, and Mason found himself enjoying the easy conversation. Felicity asked about the ranch, about the work that needed doing, about the town of Fort Davis. She was clearly intelligent and curious, and as she relaxed slightly, hints of humor emerged in her comments. After breakfast, Sarah took Felicity out to show her the garden and the chicken coop while Mason headed out to work with the cattle. He tried to focus on his tasks, but his mind kept drifting back to the house, wondering how Felicity was managing, if she felt safe yet. When he came back at midday for the noon meal, he found both women in the garden. Felicity had tied a kerchief over her hair and was on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds with fierce concentration. Her face was flushed from the sun and the work, but she looked more alive than she had the night before. "How's it going?" he asked. Sarah straightened, pressing a hand to her lower back. "Wonderfully. Felicity is a natural gardener. She has an eye for what needs doing." "My mother kept a small garden in a window box," Felicity said, not looking up from her work. "It was the only green thing in our whole building. She taught me how to care for plants, how to encourage them to grow even in poor soil. This garden is like a paradise compared to that window box." Mason smiled. "Well, I'll leave you to it. Just don't work too hard your first day." "I'm fine," Felicity assured him. "This feels good, actually." Purposeful. As the days passed, Felicity settled into life at the Turner Ranch with surprising ease. She worked hard, taking on tasks without being asked and showing an aptitude for everything from cooking to mending to managing the chickens. She was quiet much of the time, still clearly processing everything that had happened, but she was also observant and thoughtful. Mason found himself looking forward to meals, when the three of them would sit together and talk about the day. Felicity had a dry sense of humor that emerged when she felt comfortable, and she asked intelligent questions about ranching that showed she was genuinely interested in learning. More than once, he caught himself watching her as she worked, noticing the graceful way she moved, the concentration on her face when she was focused on a task. Sarah noticed, of course. His sister missed nothing. But she had the good sense not to tease him about it, at least not in front of Felicity. About a week after Felicity arrived, Mason had to go into Fort Davis for supplies. Sarah suggested Felicity go with him, to see the town properly and perhaps buy a few things she needed with her first week's wages. Felicity hesitated, clearly nervous about the prospect, but finally agreed. The ride into town was pleasant. Felicity seemed to be enjoying the landscape, pointing out birds and asking about the various plants they passed. Mason found himself explaining the ecology of the area, the challenges of ranching in this climate, the beauty of the mountains in different seasons. It was easy to talk to her, easier than it had been with anyone in a long time. Fort Davis was a small town, built around an old military fort that gave it its name. The fort had been established back in 1854 and named after Jefferson Davis before he became president of the Confederacy. The actual military presence had diminished since the war, but the town had grown, serving the ranches and farms scattered across the area. The main street had a general store, a saloon, a church, a small restaurant, and a handful of other establishments. It wasn't much, but it served the community's needs. As Mason drove the wagon down the main street, he was aware of people watching. News traveled fast in a small town, and he had no doubt that everyone had heard about Felicity's arrival and her rejection by Gerald Pritchard. Some of the looks were curious, some sympathetic, and a few held the ugly gleam of gossip and judgment. Mason pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and helped Felicity down. "Ignore the stares," he said quietly. "Small-town folks will always talk, but most of them are good people underneath." Felicity nodded, but he could see the tension in her shoulders as they walked into the store. The proprietor, Mr. Jameson, was a friendly man who greeted them warmly and showed no sign of judgment as he helped Felicity select fabric for a new dress, thread, needles, and a few personal items. They were finishing up the transaction when the door opened and Gerald Pritchard walked in. Mason felt Felicity freeze beside him, her hand clutching his arm. Pritchard saw them immediately and his expression darkened. Well, Pritchard said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "If it isn't my runaway bride, I see you found yourself a new benefactor, Miss Owens. I hope you are serving Turner better than you refused to serve me." The implication in his words was deliberately crude. Mason felt rage flood through him, but he kept his voice level. "Watch your tongue, Pritchard." "Or what?" Pritchard stepped closer. He was a big man, taller than Mason and heavier, with a florid face that spoke of too much drinking. "You'll defend her honor." "What honor? She's a mail-order bride who ran away from her obligation. She owes me money, Turner. I paid for her passage out here." "I owe you nothing," Felicity said, her voice shaking but determined. "Your letters promised marriage, a partnership. What you offered was slavery and worse. I'd rather die than accept that." Pritchard's face flushed darker. "You ungrateful little wretch. Do you know how many women would be grateful for what I offered? A home, security, a place in society." "At what cost?" Mason interjected. "From what I understand, your offer came with conditions that no decent man would propose and no decent woman would accept." "This isn't your business, Turner." "The woman owes me money, and I mean to collect one way or another." "She owes you nothing," Mason said flatly. "Your contract was for marriage, and marriage requires consent. She didn't consent, so there's no contract. The money you spent on her passage is your loss, payment for being a poor judge of what a woman might accept." "You are going to regret interfering," Pritchard snarled. "I have influence in this town. I can make things very difficult for you." "Try it," Mason said, meeting Pritchard's eyes steadily. "But before you do, remember that I know things about your business practices that the law might find interesting. I know about the water rights you've been claiming that aren't yours, and I know about the way your first wife died. So does half the county, for that matter. You want to start a war with me over this woman, go ahead, but you won't like how it ends." The threat hung in the air between them. Pritchard's eyes narrowed, calculating. Finally, he spat into the corner, making Mr. Jameson wince at the disrespect to his clean floor. "Keep her then," Pritchard said. "She's not worth the trouble anyway. Scrawny little thing wouldn't have been much use in bed or out of it." He turned and stalked out of the store, slamming the door behind him. In the silence that followed, Mason realized that Felicity was trembling violently, still clutching his arm. He covered her hand with his own. "He's gone. You're all right." "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought he might try to drag me out of here." "Not while I'm breathing," Mason said. He looked at Mr. Jameson, who was watching them with a mixture of concern and approval. Put everything on my account, including an extra bolt of that blue fabric Miss Owens was looking at. Consider it a bonus for her hard work." "Mason, no, that's too much," Felicity protested. "You've earned it," Mason said firmly, "and blue would suit you." Mr. Jameson smiled and wrapped up the additional fabric. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon and prepared to leave town, several people approached them. Mrs. Chen, who ran the restaurant, gave Felicity a warm smile and invited her to come by for tea sometime. The blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Rodriguez, told Felicity she was brave for standing up to Pritchard. Even the minister stopped them to offer his support and to say that Felicity would be welcome at the Sunday service. By the time they left town, Felicity looked overwhelmed but also touched. "I expected everyone to judge me," she said as they drove home, "to think I was a fallen woman or a troublemaker." "Most people in Fort Davis are good folks," Mason said. "They know what Pritchard is like, even if they're sometimes afraid to say it to his face. He has money and influence, but that doesn't make him respected. What you did, standing up to him, choosing dignity over security, that takes courage. People admire that." "I was so frightened," Felicity admitted. "When he walked into the store, I wanted to run and hide. But then I thought about everything you and Sarah have done for me, how kind you have been, and I didn't want to shame you by acting like a coward." "You could never shame us," Mason said. "But for what it's worth, I'm proud of how you handled yourself. You were brave." Felicity was quiet for a moment. "What you said to him, about knowing things about his business and his first wife, was that true?" Mason nodded grimly. "Every word. Pritchard has been stealing water from upstream properties for years, redirecting flows to benefit his land at the expense of others. And his first wife, Margaret, had bruises every time anyone saw her. She was afraid of him. Anyone could see that. When she died in that riding accident, it was convenient for Pritchard. He got her dowry and got rid of a wife he'd grown tired of mistreating. Why has no one done anything about it?" "Money and influence," Mason said. "Pritchard knows the right people, pays the right bribes, and proving what he did to Margaret would be nearly impossible now. But everyone knows. That's almost as powerful as legal proof in its own way. It means people watch him, and it means he has to be careful about what he does in public. Still, he threatened you. He could cause problems for your ranch." "Let him try," Mason said. "The Turner Ranch has been here for 30 years. We have friends and allies of our own, and our reputation is solid. Pritchard can make noise, but he can't actually hurt us without exposing himself to more scrutiny than he wants." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, watching the landscape shift from the town's environs back to open range. Mason found himself very aware of Felicity beside him, the warmth of her presence, the way the wind caught strands of her hair and made them dance. "Mason," Felicity said softly, "why are you really doing all this for me? The job, the protection, defending me against Mr. Pritchard. You keep saying it's the right thing to do, but there must be more to it than that." Mason considered his answer carefully. "My father used to say that you can judge a man by how he treats people who can't do anything for him, people who are vulnerable, who need help. He said that was the measure of real character, not how much money you had or how much land you owned. When I saw you crying in the street, I saw someone who needed help, and I realized that what I did next would say everything about who I was as a man. I could walk away, tell myself it wasn't my problem, or I could do what I knew was right. That's all it was at first, just doing what was right." "At first?" Felicity asked, picking up on the qualification. Mason glanced at her, then back at the road. "At first," he confirmed. "Now it's different. Now I know you and I like you. I admire your strength and your determination. I enjoy your company, so now I'm not just helping a stranger. I'm helping a friend. Is that all right? Felicity smiled, the first full, genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, making her eyes light up and revealing a dimple in her left cheek. Yes, that's all right. I'm glad we're friends, Mason. You and Sarah both. I haven't had real friends in a very long time. Something in the way she said it made Mason's heart ache. He wanted to ask about her life in Boston, about what she'd endured, but he sensed that she'd tell him when she was ready. Pushing wouldn't help. When they got back to the ranch, Sarah was delighted with the fabric and the town's reaction to Felicity. As the women planned the new dresses Felicity would make, Mason went back to his work, but his mind kept returning to the conversation in the wagon. Friend, he'd said. But was that really all he wanted? The question troubled him over the following weeks. As autumn deepened and the weather grew cooler, Mason found himself spending more time around the house, finding excuses to be near Felicity. He taught her to ride, first on the gentlest mare in his stable, then on progressively more spirited horses as her confidence grew. He showed her the boundaries of the ranch, the best spots for watching wildlife, the hidden spring where the water ran cold and clear even in the height of summer. Felicity absorbed it all with obvious joy. She'd never been out of Boston before her journey to Texas, and the open spaces seemed to fill her with wonder. She asked endless questions about the plants, the animals, the way the ranch operated. Mason found himself looking forward to her questions, to the excuse they gave him to spend time with her. Sarah watched their growing friendship with knowing eyes but said nothing, for which Mason was grateful. He wasn't ready to put words to what he was feeling, wasn't sure it would be fair to Felicity even if he could. Then came the day, about 6 weeks after Felicity's arrival, when everything changed. Mason had gone out early to check on the cattle in the north pasture, and he returned to find Sarah in tears and Felicity sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands, her face pale. "What happened?" Mason demanded, looking between them. "It's from Mr. Henderson, the stagecoach driver," Felicity said, her voice hollow. "He wrote to warn me. Mr. Pritchard has been making inquiries with legal contacts in San Antonio, trying to find a way to force me to pay back the money he spent on my passage. Mr. Henderson heard about it from another driver and thought I should know." Mason took the letter and read it quickly. Henderson had been thorough, detailing Pritchard's efforts and noting that while most lawyers had told Pritchard he had no legal case, he'd finally found one willing to file a claim. The lawyer was planning to come to Fort Davis within the next few weeks to pursue the matter. "This is ridiculous," Mason said. "He has no case. You never married him, there was no contract beyond an agreement to marry, and that agreement required your consent." "But I have no money to fight him in court," Felicity said. "Even if I'm in the right, I can't afford a lawyer. And what if the judge sides with him? What if they decide I do owe him the money? I'd have to either pay it, which I cannot do, or end up in jail, or worse, be forced to work for him after all." Sarah knelt beside Felicity's chair and took her hands. "We won't let that happen. Will we, Mason?" Mason's mind was racing, sorting through options. Finally, an idea came to him, so simple and obvious that he wondered why he hadn't thought of it before. "Marry me," he said. Both women stared at him. Sarah's mouth fell open and Felicity looked like she'd been struck. "What?" Felicity whispered. Mason pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, leaning forward earnestly. "Marry me. If you are my wife, Pritchard has no claim on you at all. His whole argument rests on the idea that you breached an agreement to marry him. But if you are already married to someone else, that agreement is void. You were never his, you're mine, and he has no case." "Mason, that's crazy," Sarah said. "You can't just marry someone to solve a legal problem." "Why not?" Mason asked, not taking his eyes off Felicity. People marry for all kinds of reasons. Love, money, land, family alliances. Why not marry for protection and friendship? Felicity and I get along well. We could build a good life together. But you barely know each other, Sarah protested. We've lived under the same roof for 6 weeks. I know she works hard, has a good sense of humor, and doesn't complain about difficulties. I know she's brave and principled. That's more than a lot of married couples know about each other when they start. What about love? Sarah demanded. What about it? Mason countered. Love is a luxury, Sarah. Respect, trust, friendship, those are necessities. Felicity and I have those things already. Love can grow from there or not, but we'd still have a solid foundation. Through all of this, Felicity had been silent, staring at Mason with an unreadable expression. Finally, she spoke. Why would you do this? Tie yourself to me for life just to protect me from Mr. Pritchard's schemes. Mason reached across the table and took her hand, feeling how cold it was despite the warm kitchen. Because I care about you. Because the thought of Pritchard getting his hands on you makes me want to break things. Because these past 6 weeks have been good ones, and I think we could have a good life together. I'm not proposing a marriage in name only, Felicity. I'm proposing a real marriage, a partnership. I want you to stay here, not as an employee or a guest, but as my wife, as a full partner in this ranch and in my life. Mason, Felicity's voice broke. That's not fair to you. You deserve someone you love, someone who can be a real wife to you in every way. You would be a real wife, Mason said. In every way that matters. The rest, the physical aspect, that can happen when you are ready if you are ready. There's no rush. We have time to let this grow into whatever it's meant to be. Sarah was crying again, but this time they looked like happy tears. You really mean it, don't you? You want to marry her? Mason finally looked at his sister. Yes, I do. I have for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it or if it would be right to ask. But this gives me an excuse, a reason that makes sense. And if Felicity agrees, I'll do everything in my power to make sure she never regrets it. He turned back to Felicity, searching her face. What do you say? Will you marry me? Felicity's eyes filled with tears. I don't want you to do this out of obligation or pity. I'm not, Mason said firmly. I'm doing it because I want you to stay. Because I've gotten used to seeing you at the breakfast table, hearing you laugh with Sarah, watching you work in the garden. Because I like who I am when you are around, and I want to see where this could go. Pritchard is the excuse, but he's not the reason. The reason is that I care about you and I want you in my life permanently. The silence stretched out. Sarah held her breath. Mason waited, his heart pounding. Finally, Felicity nodded. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Sarah let out a whoop of joy and pulled them both into a hug. Mason felt relief and something deeper wash through him. He squeezed Felicity's hand, then gently pulled back from Sarah's embrace. We should do it soon, he said practically. Before Pritchard's lawyer arrives, that way when he shows up it's already a done deal. The minister, Reverend Collins, he could do it this Sunday after the service, Sarah suggested. That's only 4 days away. Is that too soon? Mason looked at Felicity. Is it? She shook her head. No. If we are going to do this, there's no point in waiting. And you are right that we should be married before Mr. Pritchard makes his move. Then it's settled, Mason said. He felt oddly calm about the whole thing, as if he'd just made the most natural decision in the world. We'll go into town Saturday to talk to the Reverend and make arrangements. Sunday, we'll be married. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm, insisting on baking a cake and making sure Felicity had a nice dress to wear. Felicity chose to wear the blue fabric Mason had bought her, and with Sarah's help, she made it into a simple but lovely dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Mason found himself nervous as Sunday approached, but it was a good nervousness, an anticipation rather than dread. He bought a new shirt for the occasion and spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to tame his unruly hair. Saturday afternoon, they rode into town as planned. Reverend Collins was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. When Mason explained the situation, leaving out the romantic aspects and focusing on the legal protection Felicity needed, the Reverend listened carefully. "I see," he said when Mason finished. "And you, Miss Owens, you consent to this marriage freely. No one is forcing you." "No one is forcing me," Felicity confirmed. "Mason has been nothing but kind and respectful. I'm choosing this." The Reverend studied them both for a long moment. "You know, I've been performing marriages for 20 years, and I've learned that they come in all varieties. Some couples are madly in love from the start. Some grow into love over time. Some never have romantic love but build something just as valuable based on respect and partnership. What matters is that you both go into this with honesty and commitment." "We do," Mason said. "Then I'll be happy to perform the ceremony tomorrow after the regular service. I'll need you both to sign the marriage register, and I'll need witnesses." "Sarah will be there," Mason said, "and we'd be grateful if Mr. Jameson and his wife would witness as well if they're willing." "I'm sure they'd be honored," the Reverend said. "I'll speak to them after tomorrow's service." They left the church and walked down the main street toward the general store. Fort Davis was busy on a Saturday afternoon, people coming in from surrounding ranches to do business and socialize. Mason noticed several people watching them, and he knew the news of their impending marriage would spread quickly. Let it, he thought. The more people who knew, the harder it would be for Pritchard to cause trouble. As if summoned by his thoughts, Pritchard appeared at the other end of the street, exiting the saloon. He saw them immediately, and his expression darkened. For a moment, Mason thought he might approach them, might cause a scene. But then Pritchard's gaze shifted to something behind them, and he seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked in the opposite direction. Mason glanced back to see Sheriff McCready standing on the porch of his office, watching the street with sharp eyes. The sheriff was a fair man who'd been in Fort Davis for a decade. He knew everyone and everything that happened in the town. When his eyes met Mason's, he gave a slight nod. A message Mason understood. The sheriff was watching, and Pritchard knew it. They completed their errands without further incident, and the ride home was quiet but companionable. Felicity seemed lost in thought, and Mason didn't interrupt her. This was a huge step for both of them, and she deserved time to process it. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Mason found Felicity sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. He joined her, settling into the other chair. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," Felicity said. "Just thinking about everything that's happened. 2 months ago, I was in Boston, desperate and alone. I agreed to marry a stranger because I had no other options. It seemed like such a terrible risk, such a frightening leap. And it was all of that. But somehow it brought me here to this place, to you and Sarah. If Mr. Pritchard had been the man his letters claimed, if he'd been kind and decent, I'd be marrying him right now. I'd never have known you existed. That thought makes me sadder than it probably should." Mason felt warmth spread through his chest. "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad things worked out the way they did, even if the path was hard." "Are you really sure about tomorrow?" Felicity asked, turning to look at him. "You can still change your mind. I'd understand." "I'm not changing my mind," Mason said firmly. "I want this, Felicity. I want you here as my wife, as my partner. I know this isn't a conventional courtship, and I know there are uncertainties ahead, but I believe we can build something good together. Something real." Felicity reached over and took his hand, the gesture simple but significant. "Then I'll do my best to be a good wife to you, to be worthy of your faith in me." You already are, Mason said, just by being yourself. They sat like that for a while, holding hands in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night. Mason felt a sense of rightness about the whole situation that he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the passionate, overwhelming feeling that people wrote about in romantic novels, but it was something solid and warm and real. A foundation, he thought, something they could build on. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect autumn weather. Mason dressed carefully in his new shirt and best trousers, his hands shaking slightly as he buttoned the shirt. This was really happening. In a few hours, he'd be a married man. Sarah was in a flurry of activity, fussing over the cake she'd baked and making sure everything was perfect. When Felicity emerged from her room wearing the blue dress, both Mason and Sarah stopped and stared. "You look beautiful," Sarah breathed. She did, Mason thought. The dress fit her perfectly, showing the delicate lines of her figure and making her eyes glow like sea glass. Her hair was pinned up in a style more elaborate than her usual simple braid, with small white flowers woven through it that Sarah must have gathered from the garden. "Thank you," Felicity said shyly. "Sarah helped with my hair." "You both did wonderful work," Mason managed, finding his voice. "You're stunning." Felicity blushed, a pretty pink coloring her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." The ride to town was quiet, but the silence was charged with anticipation. When they arrived at the church, a surprising number of people were gathered outside, clearly waiting for them. Mason realized that word had spread, and the community had turned out to support them. Mrs. Chen approached with a warm smile. "We heard about the wedding. We wanted to be here to witness it, if that's all right." "Of course," Mason said, touched by the gesture. "Everyone is welcome." The church was nearly full by the time the regular service began. Mason sat beside Felicity in the front pew, acutely aware of her presence, the soft sound of her breathing, the warmth of her beside him. The service seemed to pass in a blur, Reverend Collins' sermon about love and commitment taking on new significance. Then the regular service ended, and those who'd come just for the wedding settled back in their seats while the Jamesons and Sarah moved to stand at the front as witnesses. Mason and Felicity stood before the Reverend, facing each other. Mason had been to plenty of weddings in his life, but he'd never really thought about the words before. Now, as Reverend Collins began the ceremony, each word seemed weighted with meaning. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join Mason Turner and Felicity Owens in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but with reverence and commitment. It is a partnership, a sacred bond between two people who choose to walk through life together, supporting each other through joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship." The Reverend looked at Mason. "Mason, do you take Felicity to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" "I do," Mason said clearly, his eyes on Felicity's face. "And do you, Felicity, take Mason to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Felicity's voice was softer than Mason's, but just as certain. "I do." "The rings," Reverend Collins prompted. Mason had bought simple gold bands at the jeweler's on their Saturday visit. He produced them now, and the Reverend blessed them before handing them back. Mason took Felicity's hand, marveling at how delicate it felt in his own work-roughened one, and slid the ring onto her finger. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, the traditional words feeling surprisingly natural. Felicity took the other ring, her hands trembling slightly, and placed it on Mason's finger. "With this ring, I thee wed." Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Texas and the church, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mason, you may kiss your bride." Mason had been thinking about this moment, wondering if it would be awkward or forced. But when he leaned in and gently pressed his lips to Felicity's, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The kiss was soft and brief, but it sent warmth flooding through him. When they pulled apart, Felicity was smiling, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The church erupted in applause, and suddenly they were surrounded by well-wishers. Mrs. Chen insisted they come to her restaurant for a celebratory meal. Mr. Jameson shook Mason's hand and told him he was a lucky man. And Sheriff McCready made a point of congratulating them both and mentioning loudly that any legal claims against Mrs. Turner would be invalid now that she was married to another man. The message was clear and public. Pritchard's plans were finished. Through the crowd, Mason caught sight of the man himself, standing in the back of the church. For a moment, their eyes met. Pritchard's face was twisted with fury, but there was nothing he could do. He turned and stalked out, leaving the celebration behind. The reception at Mrs. Chen's restaurant was more elaborate than Mason had expected. It seemed like half the town had contributed food or decorations, turning the simple meal into a proper wedding feast. Mason sat beside Felicity, their hands linked on the table, accepting congratulations and best wishes from what felt like everyone in Fort Davis. "You did good, Turner," Sheriff McCready said quietly, pulling Mason aside for a moment. "That girl needed protection, and you gave it to her. Pritchard's been asking questions, stirring up trouble, but he can't touch her now. He knows it, too. I'd wager he'll drop the whole matter rather than look like more of a fool. Thank you, Sheriff, for keeping an eye on things." "That's my job," McCready said. "But between you and me, I'm glad to see someone stand up to Pritchard. He's had his way in this town for too long." This was a good day's work. As the afternoon wore on, Mason found himself relaxing into the celebration. Felicity seemed to be doing the same, laughing at jokes and accepting the warm wishes of the townspeople. She looked happy, Mason thought. Genuinely happy, not just relieved or grateful. That meant something. Finally, as the sun began to set, they made their excuses and headed home with Sarah. The ride back to the ranch felt different somehow. Mason was acutely aware that Felicity was now his wife, that she'd be sharing his home and his life permanently. The thought filled him with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. When they arrived home, Sarah tactfully announced that she was exhausted and heading straight to bed, leaving Mason and Felicity alone in the main room. An awkward silence fell. They were married, but they were still essentially strangers in many ways. "What happened now?" "I should probably clarify something," Mason said finally. "When I proposed, I meant what I said about there being no rush for the physical aspects of marriage. The spare room is still yours for as long as you want it. I won't pressure you or expect anything you are not ready to give." Felicity looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "That's very kind of you, and I appreciate your patience. But Mason, I'm your wife now. I want to be a real wife to you in all ways. Maybe not tonight, we both need time to adjust, but soon. I don't want a marriage in name only." Mason felt his heart rate pick up. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated." "I'm sure," Felicity said softly. "These past weeks, I've come to care for you very much. You've been so good to me, so patient and kind. When you kissed me today, it wasn't frightening or unpleasant. It was nice. I'd like to explore that to see where these feelings lead, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Mason said, his voice rough. "More than willing." Felicity smiled and stood up, moving closer to him. "Then kiss me again, like you mean it this time." Mason didn't need to be asked twice. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, deeply, pouring into it all the feelings he'd been holding back. Felicity responded with surprising passion, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Soon," Felicity whispered against his lips. "But for tonight, can we just hold each other? I want to fall asleep in your arms, to wake up knowing I'm safe and wanted. Anything you need," Mason promised. "Always." They moved to his room, and Mason helped Felicity out of her wedding dress with hands that were surprisingly steady despite his nervousness. She changed into a nightgown while he changed into his sleeping clothes, both of them moving with careful awareness of each other. Then they climbed into bed together, and Mason pulled Felicity into his arms. She fit against him perfectly, her head resting on his chest, her hand over his heart. Mason pressed a kiss to the top of her head and felt her sigh contentedly. "Thank you," she murmured sleepily, "for everything. For saving me, for protecting me, for giving me a home and a future. For being the kind of man who means it when he says someone is safe." "You don't have to thank me," Mason said. "You're my wife now. Taking care of you isn't a favor, it's my privilege and my joy." Felicity tilted her head up to look at him. "I think I could fall in love with you, Mason Turner. I think maybe I already am, just a little bit." Mason felt something expand in his chest, something warm and bright and hopeful. "I know I'm falling for you, Felicity Turner, more every day." She smiled and settled back against him. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. Mason lay awake longer, marveling at the turn his life had taken. A few months ago, he'd been content but lonely, going through the motions of running his ranch without really thinking about the future. Now he had a wife, a partner, someone to build a life with. It wasn't how he'd imagined finding love, but it felt right in a way he couldn't quite explain. The weeks that followed their wedding were an adjustment period for both of them, but a happy one. Felicity continued to work alongside Sarah during the day, but now she shared Mason's bed at night. They were careful with each other at first, learning the boundaries and rhythms of physical intimacy. Mason kept his promise to be patient, never pushing for more than Felicity was ready to give. About 2 weeks after the wedding, Felicity finally initiated more than just kissing and holding. They made love slowly and carefully, Mason watching her face for any sign of discomfort or fear. But there was none. Felicity gave herself to him with trust and growing passion, and afterward she cried in his arms, but this time from happiness rather than fear. "I never thought I could feel safe like this," she told him, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I never thought I could want someone the way I want you. You have me," Mason assured her, "all of me for as long as you want me." "Forever then," Felicity said. "I want you forever." As autumn turned to winter, their relationship deepened and strengthened. They fell into an easy partnership, working together during the day and holding each other at night. Felicity proved to be an asset to the ranch beyond just housework. She had a sharp mind for numbers and helped Mason organize his accounting. She also had ideas for expanding the garden and perhaps raising more chickens to sell eggs in town. True to Sheriff McCready's prediction, Pritchard dropped his legal threats. Mason heard through the grapevine that the lawyer from San Antonio had taken one look at the marriage certificate and told Pritchard he had no case whatsoever. Pritchard had apparently been furious, but had no choice but to accept defeat. He kept his distance after that, avoiding Mason and Felicity whenever they came to town. Winter in West Texas was mild compared to what Felicity had known in Boston. But there were still cold days when frost painted the grass white and their breath misted in the air. On those days, Mason would come in from working to find Felicity and Sarah by the fire, sewing or reading. It felt like coming home to something precious, something he'd always wanted without quite knowing it. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply but joyfully. Mason gave Felicity a beautiful shawl he'd had Mrs. Rodriguez weave in soft blue wool. Felicity gave him a shirt she'd made herself, with careful stitching that spoke of hours of work. Sarah gave them both her blessing and her joy, claiming she'd never seen her brother happier. "You're good for him," Sarah told Felicity one day when Mason was out working. "He's lighter now, more alive. He went through the motions before, but now he's really living. Thank you for that." "He's good for me too," Felicity said. "He saved my life, but more than that, he gave me a reason to want to live it. I was so lost and scared when I came here. Now I have purpose and hope and love. I never expected to find love, but I did." "You both did," Sarah said warmly. "It's beautiful to watch." As winter melted into spring, Felicity began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited to be sure before telling Mason, but when she was certain, she pulled him aside one evening after dinner. "I have news," she said, taking his hands in hers. "We're going to have a baby." Mason's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, wonder, before settling on pure happiness. He picked her up and spun her around, making her laugh, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "Are you happy?" Felicity asked. "I know we haven't been married long." "I'm thrilled," Mason assured her. "A baby, our baby, it's perfect." He knelt down and pressed his forehead against her stomach, his hands gentle on her waist. "Hello in there, little one. I'm your father, and I already love you more than words can say. We both do." Felicity ran her fingers through his hair, overcome with emotion. This was really happening. She was going to be a mother. She was going to raise a child with this good, kind man who'd appeared like a miracle when she needed him most. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Felicity continued to work, though Mason and Sarah both insisted she take it easier. By summer, her belly was round and prominent, and she'd given up most of the heavier work. She spent her time sewing tiny clothes, preparing a cradle Mason had built with his own hands, and dreaming about the future. They didn't know if the baby would be a boy or a girl, but they talked about names endlessly. Mason wanted strong names with good meanings. Felicity wanted names that felt warm and welcoming. They eventually agreed on a few options for each possibility. In late August, as the Texas heat reached its peak, Felicity went into labor. Sarah sent Mason for the midwife, Mrs. Rodriguez, who delivered half the babies in Fort Davis. The labor was long and difficult, and Mason paced the porch like a caged animal, forbidden from the bedroom where Felicity was bringing their child into the world. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard the thin, reedy cry of a newborn. His heart nearly stopped. A moment later, Sarah appeared at the door, tears streaming down her face but smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A beautiful, healthy son, and Felicity is tired but doing well." Mason pushed past her into the bedroom. Felicity lay in the bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. Mason approached slowly, afraid to break the sacred atmosphere of the moment. "Come meet your son," Felicity said softly, smiling at him. Mason sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face peering out of the blanket. His son had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features. His eyes were squeezed shut and he was making small, snuffling noises. "He's perfect," Mason breathed. "You're perfect." "Thank you, Felicity. Thank you for this gift." "We made him together," Felicity said. "We're a family now, a real family." They'd agreed that if they had a son, they'd name him Matthew, after Mason's father. Matthew Turner, born on August 23, 1879 in Fort Davis, Texas. Their son, their future, their joy. The next few weeks were exhausting but wonderful. Matthew was a good baby, only fussing when he was hungry or needed changing. Felicity took to motherhood naturally, and Mason discovered depths of love he hadn't known existed. Holding his son, watching Felicity nurse him, seeing Sarah fuss over her nephew, it all filled him with a contentment that was almost overwhelming. One evening, about a month after Matthew's birth, Mason and Felicity sat on the porch together while Sarah watched the baby inside. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red, and the air was finally cooling from the day's heat. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Felicity asked. "If that stagecoach driver hadn't defended me, if you hadn't been in town that day, if I'd ended up with Mr. Pritchard after all." "I try not to," Mason admitted. "It makes me too angry, thinking about what he might have done to you." "I think about it sometimes," Felicity said. "Not the bad parts, but the path that led me here. All the terrible things that happened, losing my parents, being desperate enough to answer that advertisement, traveling halfway across the country to marry a stranger. It all seemed like such tragedy, such hardship. But it brought me to you. To this life, this ranch, our son. I wouldn't change a single thing if it meant not ending up here." Mason pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was so lonely before you came, I didn't even realize it. I had Sarah, I had the ranch, but something was missing. You filled that empty space, Felicity. You and Matthew both, you made my life complete." "I love you," Felicity said, turning to look at him. "I don't think I've said it enough. I love you, Mason Turner. I love your kindness and your strength. I love how gentle you are with Matthew and how patient you were with me. I love the life we're building together." "I love you too," Mason said. "More than I knew I could love anyone. You're my heart, Felicity. You and our son, you're everything to me." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. From inside, they could hear Sarah singing softly to Matthew, some old lullaby their mother used to sing. Mason felt a sense of peace settle over him, deep and abiding. This was what life was meant to be, he thought. Not grand adventures or dramatic moments, but this, quiet evenings with the people you loved, watching the sun set on another good day. The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. Matthew grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. When he was 3, Felicity gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Mason's mother and after Pritchard's first wife, a small act of remembrance for a woman who'd had no one else to mourn her. Margaret was followed 2 years later by another son, Samuel, and then 3 years after that by twin daughters, Rose and Ruby. The Turner Ranch prospered under Mason and Felicity's joint management. They expanded slowly but steadily, buying additional land when it became available, improving their stock, and building a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. Felicity's head for numbers proved invaluable, and her ideas about diversifying their income helped them weather the occasional bad years when drought or disease threatened the cattle. Sarah eventually married a widower from town, a kind man named Thomas Cooper who'd lost his first wife to illness. She moved into town with him but remained close to Mason and Felicity, visiting often and doting on her nieces and nephews. Gerald Pritchard's fortunes declined over the years. His shady business practices caught up with him eventually, and he lost most of his land to creditors. He became a bitter, solitary figure, avoided by most of the community. Mason felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a sort of sad reflection that a man who could have done good with his advantages had chosen cruelty instead. Fort Davis itself grew and changed as Texas settled into statehood, and the wild days of the frontier faded into history. The railroad came through, bringing new people and new opportunities. The town got its first school, and Mason and Felicity were instrumental in establishing it. Wanting their children to have educational opportunities they'd lacked through it all, Mason and Felicity's love deepened and matured. The passionate attraction of their early days mellowed into something richer and more comfortable, like a well-worn pair of boots that fit perfectly. They still made love regularly, still found joy in each other's touch, but they also treasured the quiet moments, the comfortable silences, the easy partnership of running a household and raising children together. Mason never forgot how Felicity had looked that first day, crying in the street, lost and afraid. Sometimes he'd catch sight of her across the ranch yard, laughing with their children or hanging laundry in the sun, and he'd marvel at the transformation. This confident, happy woman bore little resemblance to the desperate mail-order bride who'd been cast aside by a cruel man. But she was also still the same person, the brave soul who'd refused to accept abuse even when the alternative was uncertainty and poverty. "What are you thinking about?" Felicity asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch again, a habit they'd maintained through all the years. The children were in bed and they had this rare moment of quiet together. "That first day," Mason admitted, "when you arrived in town, when I found you crying." Felicity smiled. "I think about that day too. I was so scared, so certain my life was over. And then you appeared and said those words, 'You're safe now,' and you meant it. You really meant it." "I did mean it," Mason said. "I still do. You're safe with me always." "I know," Felicity said. "That's the gift you gave me, Mason. Not just safety from Mr. Pritchard, but the knowledge that I could trust again. That not all men are cruel or selfish. You showed me what love really is, not in grand gestures, but in 1,000 small kindnesses, in patience and respect and partnership." "You gave me just as much," Mason said. "You gave me a family, a purpose beyond just working the ranch. You gave me love when I'd resigned myself to being alone. You made my life worth living." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the stars wheel overhead. In the house behind them, their children slept safely. Around them, the ranch they'd built together stood as a testament to their hard work and dedication. And beside him, Mason had the woman he loved, the partner he'd chosen and who'd chosen him in return. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined for themselves. Felicity had thought she'd marry for duty and endure whatever came. Mason had thought he'd remain a bachelor, married to his ranch and nothing more. But life had brought them together through hardship and chance, and they'd built something beautiful from that uncertain beginning. As they aged, they told their story to their children and later to their grandchildren. Not as a tragedy or a romance, but as a truth, that sometimes the worst moments of your life lead you to the best ones, that courage and kindness matter more than wealth or beauty, and that love can grow from the most unlikely soil if you nurture it with patience and respect. Matthew, their eldest, took over running the ranch as Mason grew older. Margaret married a teacher and opened a small school of her own. Samuel became a doctor, inspired by the kindness Mrs. Rodriguez had shown when he was born. The twins, Rose and Ruby, were inseparable and eventually opened a successful dress shop in Fort Davis. Their mother's skill with a needle passed down and multiplied. Mason and Felicity watched their children grow and thrive with pride and joy. They'd given their children what they'd both lacked in their own youths: stability, safety, love without conditions, and the freedom to choose their own paths. It was a legacy more valuable than any amount of land or money. In their later years, Mason and Felicity could often be found sitting on that same porch where they'd shared so many conversations over the decades. Their hair was gray, their hands gnarled from years of work, but the love between them remained constant and strong. "You have any regrets?" Felicity asked him once when they were both well into their 60s. Mason thought about it seriously before answering. Only that I didn't have more years to spend with you. However long we get, it won't be enough. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me, Felicity said, her eyes bright with tears. It's true, though. I'd live this life 100 times over if I could, exactly as it happened, just to have you beside me. I love you, Mason Turner. I loved you when you knelt beside me in that dusty street and promised me safety. I loved you when you proposed to protect me from Mr. Pritchard. I loved you when we made our first child. I loved you through every sunrise and every storm, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Felicity Turner, my unexpected gift, my saving grace, my heart. They lived out their days together on the ranch they'd built, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they'd lived good lives and loved well. When Mason finally passed in his sleep at the age of 78, with Felicity holding his hand, his last words were of love for her. Felicity followed him 2 years later, dying peacefully in the same house where she'd spent the happiest decades of her life. The Turner Ranch continued for generations after them, a testament to what two people could build together when they started with nothing but courage, kindness, and a willingness to see the worth in each other. And in Fort Davis, Texas, their story became a legend, not of dramatic romance but of something better. The quiet, enduring love between a cowboy who meant it when he promised safety and a mail-order bride who'd arrived crying but stayed to build a beautiful life. Their graves sit side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple shared headstone that reads, Mason and Felicity Turner, partners in life, united in love, together always. And on summer evenings, when the sun sets over the Texas landscape, they both loved. It's easy to imagine their spirits sitting on that old porch, holding hands, watching the stars come out, and marveling at the beautiful thing they created together from such unlikely beginnings. The story of Mason and Felicity proved that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare and dramatic declarations. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a helping hand extended to a stranger, in the choice to see worth where others saw only inconvenience, in the daily decision to honor vows and nurture partnership. Their love was built on a foundation of respect, grew through shared experiences and challenges, and was cemented by their mutual commitment to building something good together. Years after Felicity's death, one of their great-granddaughters found a journal Felicity had kept sporadically through her years on the ranch. In it, she'd written entries about her life, her thoughts, her feelings. One entry, written on their 25th wedding anniversary, captured the essence of their relationship. Today, Mason and I have been married 25 years. When I think back to that frightened girl crying in the street, I can hardly believe she was me. Mason saw something in me that day that I couldn't see myself, worth and strength and possibility. He gave me safety when I needed it most, not just physical safety but emotional sanctuary. He let me heal, let me grow, let me become the person I was meant to be. And in return, I gave him my whole heart. Our life hasn't always been easy. There have been hard years, losses, struggles, but through it all we've had each other. We've been partners in the truest sense, sharing the burdens and multiplying the joys. I thank God every day for the cruel man who rejected me, for the kind stagecoach driver who protected me, and most of all for the cowboy who knelt in the dust beside me and said, "You're safe now," and meant it with every fiber of his being. Mason Turner saved my life that day, but more than that, he gave me a life worth saving. I love him more now than I did the day we married, and I'll love him more tomorrow than I do today. That's what real love is, I think. Not a static feeling, but a growing thing, always deepening, always expanding, always finding new depths to explore. We've built a good life together, Mason and I. A life of purpose and love and family. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. I am blessed beyond measure, and I will never stop being grateful for the day our paths crossed. The journal was passed down through the generations, treasured as a record of a love that had transformed two lives and created a legacy that lasted long after both lovers were gone. It served as a reminder that the best love stories aren't always the ones that begin with love at first sight, but the ones that begin with compassion, grow through partnership, and endure through commitment and care. Mason and Felicity Turner's story became a part of Fort Davis history, a testament to the power of choosing kindness, honoring your word, and giving love room to bloom in its own time and way.